parties and the voters were reacting to some external factor. And the next strand of research I'm working on, which I won't tell you about, at least right now, because it's very technical and it might be better just for me to take questions, is going from these aggregate level patterns to trying to parse out the individual level process that's going on. I will tell you what our data seems to suggest, just because I think it's really interesting. Based on a new paper that I'm writing now, and I can show it to you if you want, but it may not be the best thing for me to do. We're using panel data and this horrifically complicated statistical method, which my co-author, Caitlin Malazzo, understands a lot better than I do, called structural equation modeling. And the patterns seem to support the following story. That at the beginning of this period, from roughly 1987 through 1992, when the parties shifted their positions, voters reacted by updating their partisanship. So voters started switching their partisan identifications based on the party's new positions. But later in this period, particularly between 1997 and 2001, voters stopped updating their partisanship. And what they started doing instead was taking cues from party elites and being convinced by party elites to moderate their own policy positions. Now, anyway, that's the new strand where we're actually trying to parse out the individual level mechanisms. This research is, or these patterns here are just, they certainly show that voters in Britain noticed that the parties had converged. And this pattern here suggests something was going on, possibly at the individual level. As I said, in the next paper is where we're actually trying to parse out these individual level mechanisms.
Questions actually about so the moderating effect of parties. So
yeah.
you're saying, for example, in the paper about is anyone listening?
Yeah.
And whether the people will notice what
right.
the party's doing. And you mentioned towards the end about legislative behaviour, not just rhetoric, not just manifestos. I wondered about that and building that in as a moderator. So you could say Labour. And so, because I mean, the Blair thing, for example, is the case of we've been elected as new Labour, now we must govern as new Labour, and so if they could demonstrate that in government, then that would have more effect on people.
Yeah, to go back to the previous table, one kind of interesting thing you'll note here is that if you look at perceptions of Labour, they move to the right. That is, they moderate between 1987 and 1997. Then they keep moderating between 1997 and 2001. This is a complete guess, but my best guess is that a lot of voters thought, okay, I hear that Tony Blair is saying new things. Now let's see if he actually does it. And the reason why the perceptions of Labour moderated rather strikingly between 1997 and 2001 is because people saw, okay, he's really doing the things that he promised to do beforehand. Let me make one other comment, incidentally, that I don't know if this was in your mind, Oliver, but that I've thought about a lot. That paper is anybody listening. All that shows is that when parties start talking differently in their policy manifestos, that voters don't react to that. It may be that they react to what parties actually do in government, and that what they do in government is different from what they say in their policy manifestos. It may also be that voters listen to what parties say, but they don't cue off the manifestos. They listen to what party leaders say in interviews and in televised speeches, and what they say in question time in the House of Commons, and what they write in op-ed pages and so forth. So that paper, is anybody listening, I think provides reason to believe that voters don't react much to what's in the manifestos. But of course, the one possible state of the world is that what parties say in the manifestos doesn't really match up with what they're saying elsewhere. And the voters are reacting to what they're saying elsewhere. What one of the reviewers suggested, and he or she may be right, but we couldn't check, is maybe parties don't even write the manifestos for the general public. Maybe they're really writing them for their activists, to keep their activists happy, knowing that their activists will read it line by line and will go mental if the party doesn't say what the activists want it to say, but that the general public is hardly going to pay attention. So maybe what our research shows is that political parties aren't even trying to communicate with the public via their manifestos, and that's why we don't see voters reacting. All we could say in response to that comment is that's possible, and we hope to investigate that at some future point. But that's way more than we can put into one paper. So I agree with you. What parties, the obvious retort to voters don't listen to what parties say, or they don't react to what parties say, is voters react to what parties do, particularly for governing parties. You know, one difficulty is it's awfully hard to look at what parties do and sort of scale it along a scale. You know, maybe you could look at whether they're spending more or less money on things like social welfare policy, and that would count as a move to the left, or national defense, and that would count as a move to the right or something. But I'm not really good at creating data sets. And so I wait for other people to create the data, and then I use it. No one that I know of has tried to create a scale based on actual behavior as opposed to speech.
Well, I was wondering, the policy agendas or project.
Yeah, now once that, so you're talking about Peter John and those folks. Yeah, I was at a conference in Manchester in May about that. But my understanding is, at least the papers of theirs I've read, is they're looking at, for instance, what parties say in the Queen's speech. So they're once again looking at what parties say they're going to do. And they're not, as so far as I know, looking at what the parties actually do.
Yeah, I think the first stage is the Queen's speech, but then they're looking at some legislation change and budget.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, you're right. I guess they look at what the parties talk about, and then how many bills they pass in the area that they've talked about.
Yeah.
I think that's it. But I don't think they've done any coding as to the content of the bills in that. Maybe they'll do that. If so, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
It seems your papers are all sort of answering each other's questions.
Yeah.
Because you've got...
I like to talk to myself.
Yeah, well, doing a good job.
A long love affair.
Across all the major
Right, exactly.
elements.
It's been a beautiful relationship between me and me for 20 years.
Well, that's the first step.
Yeah, right.
So you've got evidence that shows that people perceive the parties coming together.
In Britain.
So, yeah,
in Britain.
In Britain.
Right.
And if you had that elsewhere, if people perceive that parties are basically the same anyway, perceiving a change in parties' movements, they might say, okay, well, they're changing, but who the hell cares, so is everybody else. So why bother changing my vote, because it doesn't matter. And then on the other hand, you've got research that says, I think it's Tabbit's, the pragmatic versus...
yeah, that's a famous paper, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic, because it's showing that, okay, well, they may be changing on all these economic issues, which supposedly the left-right is all about.
Right.
So we don't care if they change on all these pragmatic issues because it's necessary, otherwise we're all going to go broke and end up like Africa.
Right. Yeah, this is a really nice paper that came out in the American Journal of Political Science 3 or 4 years ago called, I think, Principle versus Pragmatism, or something like that. And simplifying Margit's argument a little bit, she argues that parties or voters, when they listen to what parties say, they make a distinction between what they consider really principles, the party's core principles, which in the case of, say, a Labour Party or a left-wing party, may be a commitment to social equality or something like that, and what she calls sort of the pragmatic element of politics, which is sort of how do we go about bringing about particular results. And her argument is that voters really, they tend to dislike it if parties change their core principles. But they give the parties a lot of latitude about how they get to particular results, the pragmatic element. And she's looked at these manifestos and argued that you see a pattern that when parties talk about, sort of how we're going to get there and announce what looks like a new plan, voters kind of like that. They don't like it if it looks like the party is changing its core principles. And it might be that that's a better way of looking at it. You know, I was one of the reviewers on that paper, incidentally. I'm not at all, in my reaction, which the reason this got published, maybe some of the same reason some of my things get published, I wasn't convinced she was right. If you look at the level of statistical significance, it's like, it's not that strong. But I thought this is such a cool, original argument. And if she is right, it's so important. Let's get the paper out there, and then other people can build on it and check. But on sort of a more general point, I'm sure you're right about the fact that voters, that it's not simply critical that voters form impressions about the party's policy positions, but that they form impressions about these other things, like whether the party knows how to govern, whether they're honest. And it might be that sometimes when you change your policy positions, this also changes voters' beliefs about whether the party is reliable and competent and honest. I mean, if you follow American politics, in every election, what's the most popular charge to level against your opponent? He or she is a flip-flopper. They've changed their position. And note you're not saying the new position is wrong, necessarily. You're implying that sometimes, but what you're basically saying is, this person lacks character. You can't trust this person. And, it may well be that when a party changes its position, maybe the crucial thing isn't the position. Maybe it's the inferences people draw about, well, what does this say about the party when it changes its position? I've thought about that, and I've never really been able to figure out a good way to get a handle on it, but I'm sure that's important.
More extension.
Yeah, sure.
Going again, left-right is all supposedly about economics. If you follow the whole, I'm assuming most of your countries that you're looking at are probably more established westernized democracies.
Exactly.
Well, supposedly the whole move to post-materialism or self-expression values kind of thing. Maybe it's more important the stance these parties take on moral issues or those kind of issues rather than the left-right economic.
Yeah, that is certainly possible, and this sort of gets at another thing that's worried me, and it's one reason why we're doing new research on the European Union. The sort of substantive content of the left-right dimension changes over time. Now we've got abortion and the environment and so on in there. Well, it wasn't the big deal in the 1960s and 1970s, and that worries me, and it's worried some of our reviewers too. Well, this is a moving target where you're trying to measure parties' positions. I would love to be able to do the same thing on a series of very specific policy scales. The problem, as you can guess, is finding comparable scales across enough elections in enough countries to be able to develop any good statistical inferences. We're doing the European Union one because we actually have a lot of comparable questions across countries. I wish we could find other scales that are sort of comparable across different countries, or even within a country over time. Like here, you notice this goes from 1987 through 2001. We can't go back any farther, and we can't go far sort of further in the present because they changed the questions here. So even within the country, so that's the problem we run into, unfortunately. If you do anything except left-right, with now the exception of European integration, we just don't have, we don't have good enough measures over a long enough time. I wish we did.
Have you thought about, because you're saying that shifts, one of your papers, or a few, said that shifts in the left-right positions of the public can engender a similar shift in the centrist and right-wing parties.
Right.
Have you thought about zeroing the left-right continuum on the center of the public and then using perhaps shifts in that relative to shifts in the parties to predict it, if that makes sense, or did I lose myself in too many shifts?
I wasn't clear about when you say you're zeroing.
If you zero the left-right scale instead of in the middle, center it on whatever the middle of that scale is, the most frequent value for the public. Like if the average scale is 5.5.
Right, the most frequent position in every country and essentially every year is 5.
Is the midpoint?
Yeah, everyone, just a boatload of people put themselves in the middle. Probably half of them don't even have opinions. But that's always the number. It's 5. Yeah. Should mention the one other thing that we found. I talked about how voters don't react to parties' left-right shifts. There's again one little tiny sliver of light, if you'd like to believe that voters react. One exception, and this is in the paper called "Are Niche Parties Fundamentally Different?" that came out in the American Journal of Political Science sometime a few years ago. We had some evidence there that suggested that for mainstream parties, when they shifted, almost nothing happened. But it was different for niche parties, which we defined as communist, radical right. Anyway, parties that sort of had this narrow ideological clientele. We found that when those parties shifted away from the center, farther away, they're radicalized more, not much happened. But when those parties moderated, their vote shares just went right down a mine shaft. And we argued, kind of waving our arms, just because we really couldn't test this, that our guess was that people who were communists or Green Party members, they're not voting for those parties because they think they're going to be in government, probably. They do it, a lot of them, because they're radical people who support the National Front in France. They're true believers. They're very intense. When they view ideological moderation by their parties as betrayal and pandering and selling out. And because those voters are so policy-oriented, it's devastating if your base, if you have a policy-oriented base that thinks you're selling out. And we argue there that these niche parties are, in a sense, prisoners of their ideologies. They can't really moderate without the bottom just falling out. German Greens might be an exception. I mean, they managed to, but... Oh, yeah.
Oh my God, a lot of questions.
Yeah. Oops.
Oh, sorry. I can...
So talk about how parties update their positions towards the opinion shift. Do you think that the parties either overshoot or undershoot their position, or is their response adequate to how much the Green voter has changed?
I believe, well, 2 points about that. First of all, when parties respond to public opinion, as I mentioned, voters hardly notice. And in that sense, I can't tell you, do they shift enough to satisfy the public? Well, since the public hardly notices. I guess I'll put this in numerical terms, and I don't know if this will be helpful or not. But if you, most of these voter surveys for the left-right position are along a 0 to 10 scale, or a 1 to 10 scale. And the comparative manifesto project codings are along like this 200-point scale. But if you recalibrate that to also a 1 to 10 scale, what we tend to see among centrist and right-wing parties is when public opinion shifts by about 1 unit on a 1 to 10 scale. And incidentally, the shifts are usually smaller than that, if they shift in the mean voter position. But if they shift by one unit, then based on the comparative manifesto project codings of the party's policy programs, they shift on average by about 1/2 of 1 unit. So they tend to shift about half as much as the public has along the same scale. But there also are some lagged effects too, where if public opinion shifts, parties tend to shift contemporaneously, then they tend to continue and shift more in the next election. This is just from memory of what the coefficients looked like. If the public shifted by 1 unit, on average the party, if it was a centrist or right-wing party, would shift by maybe 4/10 of 1 unit during the same period, and an additional 2 or 3/10 of 1 unit during the subsequent period. So overall, the party would shift nearly as much as the voters, maybe 2/3 as much as the voters did. Whether that's enough or too much, I don't know. The fact that they don't shift as much as the voters, may suggest that parties are reluctant to dramatically shift their policy positions, partly because we would hope that some parties, at least, aren't solely concerned with getting votes, but they really care about the policies that they're announcing.
Can I ask a follow-up? Those parties that are already on the right, and the mean voter is shifting to the right, and they shift also to the right in response.
Right.
Isn't that a little silly, in a way? Because
well,
the mean voters get into their position.
I think there are two, because that's an interesting dynamic. I think there are 2 reasons why it might make sense for a right-wing party to shift farther to the right if public opinion moves to the right. First of all, note that the party's supporters and activists are also shifting to the right. And the party presumably wants to keep its activists happy so that they'll keep donating time and money to the party. And another way of looking at it is, if you honestly believe in right-wing policies, those are your sincere policy viewpoints, you might say, oh good, the public has moved more to the right. This gives us additional leeway to announce even more right-wing policies and still be electorally competitive. So that's frankly my best guess about what's going on.
Okay. Yost, did you have one final question? Unless you want to go on for another hour.
That's fine. I'll keep answering questions. Yeah.
We do want to eventually get to the pub, but
Absolutely.
continue on.
Absolutely. Sure.
Priorities.
Yeah.
We're taking the video with us.
You can watch us drinking later on.
You guys can go where to the DR end, right? They have a video he looks up at the DR in there.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Can I just draw the attention a little bit back to the niche party piece, which I really like, HFPS 2006.
Nice one. Wow.
Yeah, no, I mean...
I like you.
My question about the niche party was, is really a little bit about the concept, actually. I really buy the argument, but there is, of course, some criticism possible of this niche party concept. In the sense that, you know, if I go the advocate of the devil, you would say that actually any party, perhaps, or many parties, you know, would like to actually carve out their own niche in order to make it to the political scene. But to what extent is it really about niche parties, which are communists, Greens, or right? To what extent is this really new parties that have to stick to their identity?
Right. You know, just one general comment that again may be interesting to the graduate students. That niche parties paper, for some reason people really like that paper. And I would not like to criticize my own research, but I've been a little surprised that of all the papers I've written, that one really seems to have stuck in people's minds. I'm glad it did, obviously, in your mind, but it's one experience I have, and maybe some of the other professors have this too, is I can almost never predict which of my papers people will really like and which ones they won't. I've written some papers I think are very pedestrian, that have gotten wonderful reactions, and other papers that I think, you know, this is important, but the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. And the niche parties is one of the happy papers where I sort of hope people would find it interesting, and a lot of people have. So anyway, sorry, in answer to your question, you're asking about sort of about the concept of niche parties. And you know, should we look at niche parties in terms of sort of a narrow ideological clientele, or new parties versus old parties, or what have you? Well, this may give you some insight into how we actually do research. When we were deciding how to classify niche parties for that paper, we made that decision on grounds that had nothing to do with theory. We did it for the following reason. Our feeling was, you know, we initially wanted to separate out just the Green parties and the radical right parties, because these are the new parties that have narrow clienteles. But you know what? There weren't enough of those parties in the data set, and we didn't have enough data on their shifts to say anything at all convincing. And so we decided the only way we can get at anything where we have enough observations of shifts of small parties was to include the communist parties in with the Green parties and with the radical right parties. So we didn't make this decision due to any deep theorizing. I will tell you this though, we have run all the analyses that are in that paper. We've rerun all of those analyses just looking at Green parties and radical right parties. And what we find is exactly the same patterns as the ones we report in the paper where we include the communists in the definition of niche parties. With just the radical right and the Greens, the coefficients are no longer statistically significant just because there are so few observations. In answer to the question, what is a niche party? You know, it probably depends what kind of question you're interested in answering. If you're interested in how, say, party identification forms for new parties, then you'll want to look at the Greens and the radical right and leave the communists out of it. But if you're looking at the question of how do voters react to shifts by very small ideologically targeted parties, then it seems to me it's reasonable to put the communists in with the Greens and with the National Front. I can tell you just as a practical matter, the Greens and the radical right parties have been around for a short enough time that with most of the data we have, it's very hard to make any kinds of generalizations about just those two parties because we just don't have enough observations. I wish we did. maybe in 10 or 15 years we'll have more observations and we can reach more conclusions just about the Greens and about the radical right.
Let's see. Oops. Trying to pull out. Well, I'm trying to be very creative here, and so we can all see one another. I'm not sure if that
See,
will
I should
work.
move this way. Okay.
Move that way. Yeah.
There we
Okay.
go.
Well, first, before I thank Jim, I just want to say that I think the video link worked really well, and I'd like to thank Fiona and Agnieszka for making that work. I think this is, we should try to do this in the future if, there are other ELECDEM visiting guests. We'll try to do something similar. And so I'd like to thank you and Agnieszka, particularly, and Fiona as well, for making this happen, and for all of you who are there at, must be the loft somewhere. I don't know which building you're in or whatever, but thank you very much for all of you for coming and participating in the workshop. And thank you all too in Exeter for coming, for participating, and a big thank you, of course, to Jim for coming and presenting your research to us. So if you could all join me in thanking Jim officially.
Thank you.
And for those who weren't able to make it either in Amsterdam or in Exeter, it will be available on YouTube.
Oh boy! So I can download. I can prove to my wife I really was in Europe and I hadn't snuck off in Jamaica.
It's not your wife that worries. It's the bank that's worried whether you're really here or not. Yes, you'll be able to download it. It may go viral. We don't.
Oh boy. Okay.
Now I'm sorry that you won't be able to join us at the Rusty Bike, but we hope that you will celebrate in a suitable fashion after the conclusion of the seminar. We will. We're all going to, or you're all invited to the Rusty Bike. We'll have a drink and dinner there to thank Jim, but also to celebrate the Giants being one victory away from the World Series.
Right.
So Jim's in a particularly good mood about the Giants win yesterday, one game away from the World Series. So well done.
And I'll just say, for all you folks at Amsterdam, thanks very much. I appreciate your interest. It was fun talking to you and answering your questions, and the same to all of you here. I appreciate your interest.
Thank you.